my dear children. We welcome you all to our Guru Gather program, and I am once again here with you to continue our lesson on appreciation of English literary texts, and I am ready to discuss another interesting poem with you, and that is in your syllabus grade 10, and let us see what we are going to do today. The Huntsman by Edward Lowbury. I am going to discuss with you all what brought his destruction, what does this story tell us, and why is it categorized under a humorous poem. So, first of all, let us pay our attention to the word huntsman. So, when you hear that word huntsman, I know you get a feeling that it is something to do with a person who kills animals, right. So, this person is going to be someone doing a special kind of hunting, right. So, this huntsman story tells us a very serious message, but that poem is categorized under the theme of humor. So, we want to look at the poem, why is it categorized under humorous poems, and the lessons that we can learn from the poem, right. So, just look at that picture. He seems to be a man who is going through some trees, and the huntsman that we are going to discuss. But actually, if you have seen some indigenous people, that is different from this picture, and here I have chosen a picture to show that he is an energetic man who runs through the forest and try to get at his targets, right. So, remember, this man is very energetic. Why am I telling like that, and what is the reason for that? First of all, I am going to introduce you the poet. Edward Lowbury is an English poet, and he is an eminent bacteriologist. So, when you hear that word bacteriologist, it is something to do with science and medicine. Then how can he be a poet? So, he has written number of beautiful poems other than his profession being a bacteriologist. So, his character, his life teaches you all another lesson. Though we are going to be qualified in a field which is quite away from literature, still if you have an artistic mind, if you can enjoy a kind of music, if you can enjoy what is there in nature, and if you can read the lines in poetry and write some poetry, that person can do any other profession that he does, but still he can continue with his artistic mind and artistic taste and skills and creativity that he owns or that he is inborn with, his latent talents, right. So, after that, he being a bacteriologist have lectured worldwide, and at the same time he has jotted down ideas for his poetry. He was born to a Jewish family in Hampstead, North London. That is why we name him as an English poet. His father too was a doctor, and you understand that because of his own profession and because born to a family where his father too was a doctor, he has a good background of medicine and science rather than literature. So, let us move on to see the next slide. In the poem, there are 5 stanzas, and what is the impression you get when you read the first stanza? We are going to read the first stanza and discuss this. I thought it is much better to read the whole poem at once, and then let us take stanza by stanza and go on with our discussion, right. So, can you see the picture that I have just put there on the slide? There is a man and that man has a spear in his hand. At the same time, he is vigorously going to throw that spear towards the animal. Did you spot out what that animal is? Yes, it's a lion. So think of a fight, or that man is going to kill a lion. I think in the poem Huntsman, we find the animal lion again. What does a lion represent? It is a symbol of bravery, and at the same time it seems to be a very ferocious, very vigorous animal, right? So that man is also equally clever to kill such an animal. So this character of the huntsman is presented as a person who is very brave, because definitely he should be brave enough to get a target of killing a lion, right? So then that hunter is presented as a brave and clever huntsman, because he hunts lions. That is why I told you he is a special hunter, because he is good at killing lions, equally ferocious animal, right? So I think you got an idea about this man and his capacity, right? His talents and his skills that he has as a huntsman to do his job, right? So hunting is not a good job, but in most of the countries it is done as sports, as well as they hunt animals for their food. But here killing lions means it may be to take its flesh or the skin, or else as a sport. But anyway, this huntsman's character is going to be a very special one for us. You will understand when we read the poem, right? Kagwa hunted the lion through bushes and forest, went spear. One day he found the skull of a man and said to it, "How did you come here?" The skull opened its mouth and said, "Talking brought me here." Kagwa hurried home, went to the king's chair and spoke, "In the forest I found a talking skull." The king was silent, and then he said slowly, "Never since I was born of my mother have I seen or heard of a skull which spoke." So there is much to discuss in these two stanzas. First of all, let's read the poem together at a stretch. The king called out his guards. "Two of you now go with him and find this talking skull. But if his tale is a lie and the skull speaks no word, this Kagwa himself must die." They rode into the forest. For days and nights they found nothing. At last they saw the skull. Kagwa said to it, "How did you come here?" The skull said nothing. Kagwa implored, but the skull said nothing. So you can see the picture of the jungle, and they were just looking for this skull for some time, for some days, but they could not find it easily. And then what happened next? The guards said, "Kneel down." They killed him with sword and spear. The skull opened its mouth. "Huntsman, how did you come here?" And the dead man answered, "Talking brought me here." How do you feel at the end of the poem? Did you listen to that? And just think of the picture. Actually, there were two king's men. Here in the picture you have only one. And then how did they kill this man? With a sword and spear. So I am going to talk about all these words. They are very special to take some other meanings other than what they as appear in the poem, right? So how do you feel at the end of the poem? Did you feel sorry for this huntsman? Are you happy or sad to read or to listen to a poem like this? Do you feel sorry for the huntsman? Actually, if you feel sorry, why is that? Why do you feel so? If you were Kagwa, how would you behave? So this is a very important question again. If you were Kagwa, how would you behave? Are you going to do the same things? If you were Kagwa, how would you behave? Are you going to do the same things that Kagwa did. So, we have to discuss whether he did something wise or he was not so. So, let us see what we can do with the rest of the lines in the poem. I am going to take the first stanza and discuss the meaning of it. All what is shown here is horrible. Don't you think so? The whole story that we heard and we are going to read seems to be something to do with a man who is going to die at the end. At the same time, he kills animals, and then after that what he finds or meets in the jungle is a skull, and that skull is going to be something mysterious because that skull can speak. It's a special skull then, right? So, the story anyway talks about the death of a hunter, at the same time death of animals because he killed lions. How do you find such a poem as humorous? So, that is my question from the beginning, right? So, what makes it a humorous poem? We have to think of it and we have to find the reasons why we are going to say or why we are going to take it as a humorous poem. So, that is my effort to point out these things while explaining the meaning of the poem, right? Kagwa hunted the lion, through bushes and forest went his spear. One day he found the skull of a man and said to it, "How did you come here?" The skull opened its mouth and said, "Talking brought me here." I didn't take your attention to that picture of the skull first of all, because now I have shown you a picture when this man was hunting, and the words that I have included, through bush and forest went his spear. Kagwa hunted the lion. I explained you that he is presented as a very brave person, at the same time very clever because he uses the spear only. From far away he takes his target, throwing his spear to kill lions. It is not an easy task, children. So, such a man just finding a skull, asking a question, "How did you come here?" So, don't you think what he said, what he asked is quite silly? From a skull, man is asking, "How did you come here?" Think in that skull has life like. So, very mysteriously, the skull also opened its mouth and said, "Talking brought me here." So, do you think a skull can speak? So, all these things bring a kind of humor, because not because what they say, but the situation where this man is asking a skull some questions. So, it shows that though he is a clever huntsman, though he is clever and brave, he is silly, he is foolish. So, that particular idea brings a kind of humor, right, not the question. Then skull also opening its mouth and answering or replying again makes it mysterious, at the same time something unearthly, because a skull speaking is not something to do with like alive people are talking, right. So, anyway, so skull opening its mouth and speaking and raising that silly question brings a kind of humor. We find some more other things other than this incident in the poem to make it more interesting and humorous as well. But for the time being, remember the lines, "How did you come here?" and the response of that skull, "Talking brought me here." So, something very important. We understand the reason for his death. Talking. He might have uttered something wrong. He might have told something not correct. At the same time, to confuse everything, a king might have punished him and ordered to kill him. Who knows? But he gives the real reason. This foolish Kagwa could not get at the meaning. This skull gave him in a riddle like, "Talking brought me here." We understand Kagwa was not capable of understanding the meaning of this skull, the utterance or what this skull said. Kagwa hurried home. His next reaction after meeting the skull and talking to him, and then after that his immediate response to that was to get back home and straight away went to the king's chair and spoke. In the forest I found a talking skull. The king was silent. Note down that word. Then he said slowly, never since I was born of my mother have I seen or heard of a skull which spoke. Now let's pay attention to certain words that I've highlighted, right? Went to the king's chair and spoke. I have shown you a picture of a chair that can be possibly king's chair. There are so many other beautifully, elegantly done chairs, and here I have chosen a picture. Actually, what does it symbolize? Here in the line it says, went to the king's chair. Straight away the poet doesn't say that he met the king. Instead of saying met the king, the writer has used the words went to the king's chair, because king's chair is known as throne, and whenever that word throne is there in poetry or in other lines of prose and drama, we can understand that it symbolizes the king. At the same time, it reminds us of the power of the king, right? So, authority he has. So, in the forest I found a talking skull. Straight away, without thinking at least about what he is going to say will be harmful or not, he spoke these words straight away in front of the king. See the reaction of the king, children. The king was silent. Then he said slowly, never since I was born of my mother have I seen or heard of a skull which spoke. He might have told it with some pride, because it shows his maturity, at the same time his intelligence, and as a king how much he has gained and heard from the world outside, from his own mother and father, especially the father. To be a king, he has to inherit more qualities from his father, right, to be entitled to the throne. So, king is presented as a wise person, intelligent person, in contrast to this ordinary huntsman. That is why in that line the king was silent. Silence is golden, we say, right. So, there king was not showing any kind of reaction. He was silent for few minutes. He might be thinking of what to say and what he knows about. So, we understand that king was not a person who believed everything that he heard and he was told, of course, by the citizens, right. He has his own way of thinking, right. So, you understand all these things were in few words in some lines. In one of my lessons also I explained you how to analyze a poem or any other literary text with the knowledge we have. Each and every word is important. They symbolically tell us something. So, here also those things are important, and please all of you try to practice this. Read very carefully, and each and every word what it going to represent is very important, right. I think you have understood up to now, and it was the second stanza. Now, we will move on to the third stanza, and let us see how we are going to analyze the lines and the words there to get more ideas and clear or better idea about what he is going to say. The king called out his guards, two of you now go with him and find this talking skull, but if his tale is a lie and the skull speaks no word, the king, this Kagwa himself must die. That was the order of the king. He called out his men and asked them to go with this man, and then asked them and ordered them to find that speaking skull. And the punishment was also decided, right. If that skull could not speak a single word, king understood that this man has lied, and then the punishment is death for lying. Don't you think that same kind of punishment might have given to that skull that Kogwa met in the jungle or the forest? So that may be the reason that skull spoke the few words, talking brought me here. Now we understand the same fate or same punishment is there for this man as well, for not being thoughtful. That is the punishment, because before he went to that supreme power or authority to meet the king, he could have been thoughtful, because we know king's word are the words and they cannot be drawn back, withdrawn or reversible. King's words are irreversible. The words are said and those orders are done. So Kogwa forgot that. He straight away went to the king and actually, if we say, wrote his own fate because of his weakness, right? So you understand. So certain things we do also bring our own fate sometimes, or else our own punishment. So that is why we say we are calling for trouble. So when we do unnecessary things, of course, we call ourselves for trouble. So this poem teaches us how to be thoughtful before we do something, what we should do. There is a saying, think twice before you leap. Did this huntsman do that? No, he straight away went to the king to tell what he found. That was a speaking or talking skull, right? So that is why we say all these poets in their poetry or other literary works other writers do, they give us a message. That is why literature can change people's attitudes, teach them good lessons and make them better people with right and wrong, and choose what is right and to leave out what is not right. So they open up our minds. Only thing is we have to be alert, or we have to be clear in our thoughts to understand that. Otherwise, we also do literature. If we do not practice them, if we do not learn any lesson from that, we are also like Kogwa, who could not understand the meaning of the line, talking brought me here, the skull said to him, right? So please be alert and try to get at the meanings, what these writers are going to say, what these poets are going to say, and try to correct your weaknesses. Then you can be a very good citizen to this country, right? They rode into the forest. For days and nights they found nothing. At last they saw the skull. Kogwa said to it, how did you come here? The same question repeated. The skull said nothing. Ironical, right? This time the skull didn't speak. Kogwa implored, but the skull said nothing. Remember, the word said nothing also repeated in these lines to emphasize that that skull was extremely silent. We understand there is something behind that. That's a secret. First the skull spoke and tempted this man to go and meet the king. Now he is silent. Tricky manner that the skull put this Kogwa's life in trouble. Sometimes in the society also we find people like this, right? So we have to be very careful. That is why I told you this poem teaches us many lessons for life. Right, I think the first few parts, they rode into the forest. For days and nights they found nothing. When I read these lines, actually what I felt was, can this be real? For days and nights they found nothing when they were looking for this skull. Can it be true? Can it be real? Because Kogwa is a man who knows this forest very well, familiar like his home or the house. And such a man, why couldn't he direct the two guards to that place straight away? Why did they waste time in the forest? So, what is the effect of children? Can you think of it? So, these lines, I feel they are some exaggerated line to give an idea that they wasted time for days, and it keeps our anxious or our anxiety, and we become curious, what will happen next, what will happen next if they don't find this skull. We as readers know, and even Kagwa knows his destiny, his fate, but how he is going to end up his life, right. So, finding this skull is very important, and that is why that exaggerated idea, for days and nights they found nothing, to keep our suspension and to make us think and become somewhat tensioned, anxious about this. Those are some techniques used by the writers to make it real. What they are going to talk about is real, and we can be a part of it. When we read these lines, actually without our knowledge, we are also with them. We are also going to find this skull. So, the writer has beautifully created some visual imagery with these lines in our minds, right. So, that is the the use of techniques or the ability of a poet to say us or tell us how to live in his or her work. That is why we say, when something is included in the lines of literature, in a poem or in a text, those characters or those things are immortal. They do not die, they are there forever, right. So, as long as people read these lines, we can be there as a lively participant, at the same time enjoy what they say. I think you understood the purpose of reading a poem, to analyze it or to look at it critically rather than just saying. So, that is why we have a particular taste, that is why you have chosen this subject, not just to score some marks for your exam, but this is a particular subject that will help you to be a very good person and to become a kind of like very creative and lively person. The guard said, "Kneel down." They killed him with sword and spear. The skull opened its mouth. "Now, Huntsman, how did you come here?" And the dead man answered, "Talking brought me here." The exact words the skull spoke to the huntsman a few days ago, right? Now look at this dead man speaking, again that skull speaking, something mysterious. At the same time, it is a kind of humor, isn't it? This man who was silent when the guards were with the huntsman, the dead man's skull speaking, and at the same time, soon after his death, how can Kagwa speak? All these things are a kind of supernatural things. We understand anyway this skull has brought the destruction to the life of this huntsman, and the skull is partly responsible. Remember children, it gave the exact or the real reason for his death. Kagwa was blind, or Kagwa was not capable enough to understand what he said. Ultimately, Kagwa also repeated the same line, "Talking brought me here." So, when we read this poem, what is the lesson we can learn? What is the main thing, right? Unnecessary speech, or if we do not have control of our speech and if we do not know what we speak, we are going to be in trouble. Even we will end up in death as Kagwa had to, right? So, let us see what is there on my next slide. Kagwa's own folly. So, can you remember how he became a foolish man throughout this poem and in the story that the writer says with the character of Kagwa in his poem? Raising a question from a skull, it is very strange. right? How did you come here was the question, but raising a question from a skull, knowing that it does not have life, why did it speak, right? Sometimes somebody can say because Kagwa was all alone in the jungle, but it is not something new to him. He is very familiar with that setup as a brave and clever huntsman. No loneliness will be there with him as we understand, right? Then Kagwa is presented as one who is quiver in his behavior. Quiver means strange again, talking to the skull, right? He has a kind of a strange behavior other than raising that question in a very silly manner. Is unwise, right? So, how is he going to be a foolish person? Meeting the king straight away, right? As I told you, he was not thoughtful. He did not think before he leaped. He was so quick in his decision making. He was haste in his decision to meet the king. That is why good old days wise men told, haste makes waste, right? Haste makes waste. Same thing happened to Kagwa. He was in a hurry, he was impulsive. What he wanted was to inform the king about this strange thing, as if he had never met some kind of strange thing. So, that is why his strange behavior in a familiar background, right. So, he could have been more thoughtful, as I feel. In vain that he had to die like that. His fateful day was the meeting of that skull, right. Act hastily. I told you, haste makes waste. Reporting to the king immediately what he saw. So, is it clear the things that the writer has given us beyond these lines? So, that is what we call the depth of meaning, right. So, just not the word simply, but what can be there behind those words, beyond those words in their real meaning, right. So, let us see what we are going to read next. How does humor is created? That is something very important, because I was telling you that was my effort to show you, because in the syllabus they have divided your poems and other things into different themes, especially the poetry. So, this was categorized under humorous poem, right. Kagwa's question to the skull, how did you come here? Again a skull speaking, opening its mouth and saying, talking brought me here. It is exactly something that is mysterious, right. Kagwa had failed to get the message given by unusual speaking skull, because that skull was something unusual. It was capable of speaking. Unusual speaking skull. It is not something usual, right. So, skull raising the question again when Kagwa died. The huntsman, how did you come here? So, again we can say it is quite ironical to raise that question, to ask that question to Kagwa, because Kagwa implored just before his death, how did you come here? Can you remember, children? The skull was silent. So, the response that the skull gave just after the death of this man, Huntsman, we can take it as very ironical expression and a kind of ridiculing at this man for his folly, right, his foolishness. Then again we find it as a sarcastic expression, right. So, you also came here, right. So, I told you talking brought me here, you also did the same wrong things. An idea like that, right, he might have wanted to suggest. That is why he raised that question, the huntsman, how did you come here? Ironical, ridiculous and sarcastic. And we can take it as a witty exchange of ideas, because the dead huntsman And again that skull that spoke to tempt Kagwa had a very interesting exchange of ideas to make us laugh, right. So, we can take it as a very, very witty exchange of ideas, right. The idea is clear to you? Sit, my dear children, right. So, let us see what we are going to do next, the king's character. I think we found there is a king, symbol of king in several other poems, Clown's Wife, right, and then symbolic of supreme power and authority. King is that. His words are the power and authority, right. Nobody can change it. Even his own son, who is going to be the next king, may not be able to change a decision made by the king, right. So, at the same time, king being silent when he heard the words of Kagwa suggested us that king is wise or intelligent, we can say, right. So, knowledgeable and wise are two different things. Anybody can be knowledgeable by reading books, gathering knowledge from the sources, right. But for a person to become wise, other than reading things in the books, the experience that person has personally values a lot, right. It matters a lot. Wise means act according to the situation, and we understand that king is not a person who is going to sympathize with people who do wrong things. And even if Kagwa came for his own folly or for his own unthoughtfulness, king did not show any kind of sympathy towards him, and he did not believe the words at once, right. So, king's response, never since I was born of my mother. He talked about his childhood, and from there onwards up to that date, he had never heard somebody says, oh, he had never seen on his own a skull that speaks, right. So, that is why he could not believe the words of this huntsman. At the same time, it shows, as I told you earlier as well, it shows his maturity as well as experience, a point that I was discussing with you a little while ago. At the same time, there is another word, not gullible, right. King shouldn't be gullible, king should be wise. What is the meaning of gullible, children? It is to say that somebody is not going to listen to what others say at once and accept what he is being told or what he is heard of, like when others say something to us, ah, is that true? Ah, really? And after that, what we are going to do? We are going to just take those words into our minds, and we are going to do or think of what the other person said and have some other grudges or kind of like taking revenge or going to be overwhelmed and too much happy and pleasurable. So, all these things should not be there. We have to be very thoughtful, and is what this man going to tell be a true thing or not? We have to be very much thoughtful and considerate. We have to be very much attentive, otherwise, or watchful or alert, we will say, otherwise we are going to be in trouble. Just because Kagwa was not doing that, right. So, what happened to him? Death was the punishment. How clearly the skull spoke to him and said, death brought me here. He was not thoughtful enough. He was not paying his attention to that. But king did not destroy his reputation or his character by listening to what Kagwa said. He wanted to have a kind of evidence, right. So, without evidence, we should not accept anything. Until we see until we hear by our own eyes or our own ears, we should not believe what other people say. So then we are going to be on the safe side, and then we can say we are wise. Otherwise, if we are going to be gullible and believe each and every word that other people say, definitely we are going to be a trouble creator for the family as well as our own destroyer, right? Fine. Then supernatural power or supernatural element in the poem is a prominent feature, because we find a speaking skull something mysterious and incredible. We can't believe our eyes to see those words or to hear those words, right? So it becomes incredible, and then speaking skull becomes a mysterious or incredible character. At the same time, the same character is talking and other than being silent. So in an indirect manner, the skull also may represent another tricky person in the society, and the poet may be teaching us how we should be thoughtful and wise, right? So again we find the dead huntsman talking soon after his death, again supernatural. So something that is not real in our world, human world, that is something we can't believe, right? So not something happening to be seen by our naked eyes or to be heard by our own ears. Something very strange. None of us have experienced that, right? Techniques in the poem. Again, another very familiar area of discussion, and I am going to take that particular line, for days and nights they found nothing. I told you that it is a kind of exaggeration to keep the readers have their suspicion, I'm sorry, not suspicion, suspension, suspended, right? So curiosity is suspended, exaggeration and suspension is given in that, with that line, for days and nights they found nothing. Then after that, some important symbols: the king, power and authority; huntsman, to mean an uneducated ordinary citizen who will be gullible like. Speaking skull on one hand represents that supernatural power, an unearthly creature. At the same time, as I told you, we can take it as an indirect representation of a cunning person, right? Indirect representation of a cunning person. Fine. Repetition. We find, how did you come here? The skull said nothing, right? So these lines were repeated to give a kind of emphasis. Then simple and colloquial language. The language is very simple and day-to-day speaking language, and at the same time we get the dialogue form, and it brings a dramatic effect, just like or as if we are watching a drama. When we start reading the lines of the poetry, we can just feel or we can imagine that we are watching a drama, because there are some dialogues in the poem to make it real and authentic and to bring the dramatic effect. In the forest I found a talking skull. What was said to the king? Two of you now go with him. What the king says to the guards: never since I was born of my mother have I seen or heard of a skull which spoke. Again something uttered by the king to be heard by the others. And the guards order, kneel down. And in the picture I showed you that the huntsman was kneeling down and keeping his hand behind, be ready for his death. And think of that man, innocent fellow, did nothing wrong to the society or anybody else or even to the king. Only thing was that king might have understood that this is something mysterious, unusual and strange, and I have to check whether this man is lying or not. So then just because the skull was tricky, this innocent man, poor fellow, had to die, right? Sacrifice his life for nothing, right? So then dramatic effect and kneeling down and dying there. And if you were to face such a situation, can you imagine the feelings of the huntsman? He knows that little later that he is killed using the sword or the spear. Both were used. And then, oh, death comes to me next moment. So he is very stressful and he is restless and at the same time frightened and no escape at all. Think of the emotions of that man. In vain he died, right? Visual and auditory images. So that's what I was telling, all these things. So at his death, next moment, the spear or the sword will go. So those ideas are conveyed, and these pictures can be visualized when we read the lines of the poem, right? So cock was hunting, cock hunted the lion, through bush and forest went his spear. All these things are strong and powerful enough to create some visual imagery or some pictures in our mind to visualize what type of a person is Kagwa, his dress and everything will come to our mind, and handling a spear, and in the forest the lion is. All these visual images are created with the words in the line, right? At the same time, lot of assonance there. So I have taken few examples. After, I think when we introduce you the literary devices, we discuss all these techniques, and after revising this idea, you all alone read the lines and try to find some more other assonance, because I know for sure there are some more. I have taken only two. At last they saw the skull. Now think of the repetition of the letter S giving its sound at different places. Last, saw, skull. Again we see the skull speaks new words, again the same sir, right? So that must be, we can take it as a kind of tension that huntsman had, right? He knows that if that skull didn't speak, what will happen to him? So that tension is expressed, right? Fine. Then irony is there. I told you that faithful death of the hunter, and that skull's ironical, at the same time ridiculous words. I told you, the huntsman, how did you come here, right? So we know that the death of that huntsman was really ironical and very faithful, right? Themes. Too much speaking or unnecessary speaking brings destruction. So the poet indirectly tells its readers to discipline your speech. Haste makes waste. I told you that. Think twice before you leap. All these ideas are there, suggested, not directly expressed, but those are very good moral lessons for us, right? Better to have an eyewitness when you report something. So that is why even in lawsuits, even in courts, they call for eyewitness. So anybody can lie and take anything that they want if that is not practiced, right? I mean eyewitness. So we need to have a kind of eyewitness. Yes, I also saw, I also heard, something like that. Other than that, there is one more other very important lesson. What you do comes back one day. So can you remember how this huntsman Kagwa was killing lions? He used the spear. Ultimately, when God killed him, what happened to him? They also used same spear, I mean the tool, spear, not that Kagwa spear, spear and sword. So killing came to him as well. The same tools that he used to kill lions were used to kill him. So action and reaction. Even in the story Lumber Room, we discuss about that. It is law of nature really. When we do something, there is a reaction for that as well. So that then thereby again the writer makes us think, oh, Are we going to do good things or are we going to do bad things? It's up to you to choose. But the poets, the writers, they hint you this idea, right? So, to be good, and then you can have good results. If you are bad, you are going to get some repercussions or bad results. The story unfolds another important message. So, can you remember? He spoke to the king straight away. Was he thoughtful enough to think of to whom he was speaking? To whom that he is going to convey this idea? So, children, remember, when you speak to someone, always think to whom you are speaking, the level of superiority or status, mood, and the behavior, what can be when somebody is very angry, and if you are going to speak something to make him angrier, the situation will be worse. So, you have to think of the situation as well, condition as well, and status especially, right. So, when speaking to a superior or hierarchy in your level, so you have to be extremely careful when handling or using your words, and very particular about all these things, and especially when and what type of situation. The situation is worse, everything will go wrong, right. So, we have to wait for the right time. Then 2 questions. Huntsman becomes a victim of fate. Do you agree? Write your answer drawing examples from the text. The second question, sensible response and utmost care in handling strange situations, even in one's own familiar surroundings, will save you. Justify this statement in relation to the humorous poem, The Huntsman. First of all, I want to pay your attention to the second question because it is somewhat lengthy, as well as I want to teach you how to attack the question to get the points that you have to write the answers. So, when you read these lines, we see that sensible response and utmost care. So, we have to be extremely careful, and at the same time we have to be responsible in what? Handling strange situations. So, even in one's own familiar surrounding, we may be there in a very familiar setup or a background or a surrounding, right. But still, if that particular setup or the surrounding shows a kind of strange things and some unfamiliar things, we have to be thoughtful. That is why sensible response. And then we have to be extremely careful in handling the situation, even if the things around us are familiar to us. So, not because Kagwa was sensibly responsible and taking utmost care in responding to that speaking skull. Of course, the skull spoke just after that foolish fellow, if I say, raised the question. First of all, the skull did not speak. Who spoke first? Kagwa. So, he called for his trouble, calling for something, asking some questions from unwanted thing, and created his own problem, right. So, sensible response and utmost care even in handling strange situations in one's own familiar surroundings will save you. So, because Kagwa was not so, he could not save his life. Justify this statement in relation to the humorous poem. Again, another important word, humorous poem. So, you have to say this poem has humor, but still beyond that humor, we can learn so many important lessons, as well as we can get some moral values, right. So, then Huntsman become a victim of fate. My answer for the second question will give you some hints for the first question, and then you can easily write answers for that. The death of the huntsman was a result of his own mistake. He is presented as a brave and clever huntsman. So, when you start writing the answers, you can just show that your background knowledge about this, right, person or the character that you are going to talk about. He was not concerned about strange situations in his very familiar surroundings. He was less attentive to the points to whom he speaks, dead skull and king. right. So, you have to elaborate on those things, but I just pointed them down. He did not notice the gravity of reporting what he saw to the king. Supreme power is dangerous. So, I have highlighted that in given in red. Supreme power is always dangerous. King's order is irreversible, can't withdraw. His orders are definitely executed, right. He did not understand the difference and seriousness of talking to the king, just like he did with the skull. He can't talk to the king. It may be as he was excited and unfamiliar with such a mysterious experience. In contrast to the king's knowledge, experience and maturity, we find Colloquial, of course, not such wise, and he is just an ordinary immatured person in that sense, right. So, you can build up your arguments like that when you are answering a question in your test papers, and I think I discussed this poem to a greater deal. So, I think what I have done is clear enough to you all, and you could catch up some points to write some answers in your test papers, and this was just an effort to help you children, and I hope I was successful in giving that message, and I think I am going to wind up my lesson by now, because I have taught you everything necessary for this poem, and let us meet again with another interesting lesson like this. Till that time, I am going to say goodbye and stay safe.